线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Strait Talk with Xiangyu, where we dive deep into the Taiwan Strait, a pivotal frontline of the battle between Western hegemony and Eastern resistance, as well as dying interpolarity and a rising multipolar world order, bringing you a perspective of Taiwan and beyond not typically covered by Western mainstream media. Today, we have a guest who, due to the sensitivity of this topic, will remain anonymous and go by Mr. T, but he is somebody who I've met in person before, and I can vouch for his very intimate knowledge of the chip industry because of his occupation. So firstly, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me here, and appreciate the kind introduction. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, well, before we do that, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can call me Mr. T, and I'm someone who, broadly speaking, just has some familiarity with semiconductors and with sort of how TSMC plays into the tech industry more broadly.
Now, you've spoken in depth about a lot of these things, but I think we should start simple for the audience because, let's face it, most people don't understand that much about chips, most people including myself. So first and foremost, how has the chip industry become such an important focal point in global geopolitics, particularly between China and the US?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, at least in the last 2 years, it's been mostly related to the rise of AI as a demand driver for semiconductor demand. And AI is a very performance sensitive kind of workload. It's also a very power intensive workload. And because of those two characteristics, you need very, very high performance silicon in order to deliver the full capabilities of AI, right? And there's currently only one company in the world that is, I would consider, fully competitive in manufacturing the high performance silicon at high capacity or high volume, and with a high degree of reliability, right? And that's TSMC. And because of that, that sort of places Taiwan in a very unique position in the global tech industry. And of course, the bulk of TSMC's manufacturing capacity and the bulk of its leading edge manufacturing capacity is concentrated in Taiwan. So this also creates a degree of geographic concentration for its supply chain.
So for this reason, the chip company getting the most coverage in the media is, at this point, obviously TSMC. And some of its competitors include Samsung and Intel. But, how did TSMC, a company that very few people heard of before, the recent years, how did such a company in a place like Taiwan rise to its current position? And what implications does this have for cross-strait relations, Sino-US relations, and US-Taiwan relations?
Sure. So to really look at kind of the why TSMC came to be, you have to look at the semiconductor industry back when TSMC was created, right? So at the time, when TSMC was created, the leading, I think 5 out of the world's 10 leading chip makers were Japanese. So it was companies like Matsushita, Sony, et cetera, and Panasonic as well. And a lot of these companies were not necessarily, they were economic competitors to the United States, right? So what the U.S. did is it created a consortium of its own chip research companies. It was called the SEMI Consortium, not very imaginative name, or not a very imaginative name. And at the centerpiece of that consortium obviously was Intel, but they also tried inviting the Koreans and people on Taiwan to come and participate as well, right? And the goal was to build a family of companies or an ecosystem of companies that could outcompete Japan. And on that measure, they were wildly successful. The Japanese chip industry is just a pale shadow of what it once was. The U.S. accomplished this through a myriad of tactics. Some of them above board and just normal business good sense, and some of them kind of a little bit you could consider underhanded, right? But one of the key things that the U.S. did is the U.S. really opened the floodgates for Taiwan and Korea to acquire large quantities of both chip making know-how and expertise, and large quantities of chip making equipment at fairly reduced prices. And after this kind of move in the late 80s and early 90s, that was really when sort of Taiwan's chip industry began to take off, if that makes sense.
So these sort of underhanded tactics, I feel like they're making a comeback because 2 years ago, in 2022, Joe Biden signed the CHIPS Act. And could you please get into a little bit more detail about the just what the CHIPS Act actually does and also the effects of this act?
Sure. And before, I just want to clarify one thing. I don't think that these underhanded tactics are sort of making a resurgence so much as they've never really gone away.
That's a fair point. I guess for a while, because the so-called threat in the U.S. eyes became so weak, it was waiting for a new threat to come about, right?
So funny quote, right? And it's I forget where I read this, but like there was a Commerce Department official whom back in the early 2000s was quoted as saying, like, look, I have a stack of applications from Chinese chip companies like SMIC that's about this high. And he made like a motion, like, like sort of like several inches high above his desk. Right. And I'm going to deny all of them. I'm going to have a stack of applications from them to go and import advanced chip making equipment. And this was back in like the early 2000s. I'm denying all of them. Right. And that was how the U.S. maintained a stranglehold on like China's chip industry. And for a long time, actually, that didn't matter because Chinese companies had the ability to freely purchase chips manufactured elsewhere, right? But it was only in recent years that the U.S. actually began restricting the ability of Chinese companies to even buy chips. And that is what I think that's what made this whole issue so acute, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of like these underhanded things, like besides restricting the ability to buy chips, right? The U.S. also restricts the ability of Chinese chip makers to go and purchase chip making equipment. It restricts the ability now of chip makers to go and service their equipment that has been installed inside Chinese fabs. It also restricts the ability of U.S. Citizens and green card holders from working for certain Chinese semiconductor companies. And the U.S. hopes that the combination of these three measures will meaningfully impede and slow down China's technological progress. And there's a little bit more we can talk about the results of these actions later, but at a high level, I would say that these actions have been spectacularly unsuccessful. I would go as far as to say they've largely backfired. And the U.S., far from actually damaging China's semiconductor industry, is actually doing a better job of supporting China's semiconductor industry than the Communist Party of China is.
I think there is this mentality in China, which is if other people can make things better than us, we can just buy them. But then if that avenue is shut down, then it forces more self-sufficiency in any industry. Of
course. Now, like we have to always remember that there are two sides of the supply-demand equation, right?
Right.
The U.S. is constricting supply to China, and there's the Chinese side there have been some, I would say, less than realistic takes coming from the Chinese side, saying, "Hey, this is going to cost U.S. chip makers so much money." I would say that that's not really an accurate cast, right? The demand for chips coming out of AI data centers is so large that it's going to really make up for any lost Chinese demand.
Right.
So it's not like you just look at the stock price of TSMC or of NVIDIA, or
still rising.
Yeah, it's still rising, and NVIDIA is now the world's most valuable company, right?
Right.
So like that's not. I don't think that's really credible. It's not really, and I don't think and that's mainly because like these AI data center clusters that the U.S. is now talking about are so large that they are talking about clusters exceeding 1 million chips, right? So or 1 million nodes is what they call it. So like these clusters are so large that they're going to really make up for any lost Chinese demand. So that's also why the U.S. feels so confident in pursuing this course of action. Now, if I look at but if I look at the Chinese side of the equation, right? Obviously, there's that similar demand on the Chinese side, but you remove American supply out of the Chinese market, and you also create this massive demand driver for more and more chips in the form of electric vehicles, in the form of driverless cars, in the form of drones, in the form of AI and AI data centers, obviously. And what you've really done is you have now drastically, when you remove supply and increase demand, you increase price, right? This is a law of economics. And you have drastically increased the value of true R&D and innovation in the Chinese tech ecosystem, right? Like Chinese chip making equipment companies are trading at valuations that are something like 2 or 3 times the median multiple of the entire Chinese stock market right now. And Chinese AI companies are being funded to ridiculous lengths, right? Like, so this is, that is like kind of, the US has created this artificially inflated environment in China because it's confident that it doesn't really need Chinese demand for silicon in order to fund its own R&D efforts here on state side, right? And obviously with the Inflation Reduction Act, the US is also pumping large amounts of federal dollars into its own chip making industry. And with the US running a sort of almost a budget deficit at 4.5 or 5% of GDP, it's also running an extremely hot and stimulative economic policy. So it's both sides I think are investing heavily in this, and they're also diverging or sort of decoupling from each other fairly aggressively in the tech domain.
Right. So while we're on this note, could we talk about how Huawei was sanctioned from getting its chips fabbed by TSMC? I think
Sure.
What people don't understand is, some people might not understand is there's designing a chip and then there's fabbing a chip. And for the longest time, Huawei's homegrown Kirin chip was designed by them, but it was fabbed by TSMC. And the sanctions effectively got rid of their supply for actually getting the chips. And now the question has become, how do we make our own chips without TSMC, right?
Absolutely.
And what's been the mainland's response to this development?
Sure. So the mainland's response has been a series of large national level semiconductor investment funds and then small local level semiconductor investment funds, plus government subsidies, plus other indirect subsidies as well, right? So direct government injections of cash in addition to the aforementioned funds, plus free land tax waivers, right? That's like kind of how I would class those 4 areas of subsidies. And the zooming out a bit, right? Like if you design a chip, like it's sort of like drawing up the blueprint to, I don't know, like let's say you have a poster you want to make, right? You make a movie poster, right? And you want to go print it at the local Kinko's, right? That's sort of a little bit like designing a chip and printing a chip. They call chip making lithography, right? Lithography refers to the act of printing something. It's because from a very crude perspective, it really is printing. You're etching and printing patterns onto silicon, right? So that's really what TSMC is, right? You could think of TSMC as the world's most valuable like copy shop. Like the world's most valuable like printer shop
that requires the most precision in the world.
Exactly. It prints things at below 10 nanometer precision, right? So it's like but it's a printing shop. And other people come to it with its designs and it prints them. Now, obviously TSMC also has evolved into a couple of other value add sectors beyond just like straight up printing chips. But like that's the core of its business. And when the US blocks the thing is like when you design a chip, you typically design a chip assuming you know where you will print it, right? So let's say that you've designed this movie poster and you have this really nice picture of, I don't know, like you have this really, really nice like image of Jet Li, right? And you want to use it. You want to modify it, But this image of Jet Li, when it gets printed at most other print shops, the colors come out wrong. It's distorted. There's only one print shop in the world where if you print that picture of Jet Li, that image is guaranteed to come out right, if that makes sense. And you have to have this picture of Jet Li on your movie poster. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that means you can only print this movie poster in one place in the world, right? That's a little bit like, sort of like what the relationship between TSMC and chip design is. So you will have a certain types of patterns you want to print on a chip. They're called IP blocks that are things you absolutely need, to make the chip functional. And these things can't really be printed at any other fab. It's very hard to switch fab. This IP block is only logically and physically verified to sort of be printed or taped out at one fab, right? And that was the relationship between Huawei and TSMC. That is obviously no longer the relationship between those two. So Huawei essentially had to redo all of its poster designs from scratch between 2019 when it got sanctioned, or 2018, I'm sorry, 2020 when it got sanctioned, and now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, on the topic of TSMC being like a Kinko's, from the U.S. perspective, it's probably better to have a Kinko's within its own borders than on the other side of the Pacific. But maybe that's a gross oversimplification. Why do you think the U.S. is essentially strong-arming TSMC?
Because if you looked at TSMC's order volumes, if you looked at its core customer list in 2018, right, about 85% to 89% of its orders came from U.S. chip companies. So AMD, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, Apple, those four. And only 11 to 15 came from China, right? And for the U.S., that's a very large risk, since if you add up the chips that everyone was ordering off of TSMC, and then you did a percentage, you'd realize that something like between 50 to 75%, depending on whether you wanted to include automotive silicon or not, 50 to 75% of chips that U.S. companies designed were made in TSMC. And if you remove those chips, you're essentially removing 50 to 75% of the aggregate output of the American tech industry, which, in case you haven't checked, based off the latest S&P 500 valuation, like the U.S. tech industry in aggregate, I think has something between 25 and 30% of the value of the entire U.S. stock market. So if you take these percentages and you take the output, if TSMC disappearing would represent almost a tenth of American wealth vanishing.
So I have a two-parter question related to this. One is, would you say that TSMC is being strong-armed into building a plant in Arizona, or it's doing it mostly on its own free will? And secondly, how is that
it's absolutely being coerced. It's absolutely being coerced. So you may have noticed, by the way, that TSMC recently switched its CEO. Is that news in Taiwan? If I might ask.
People know about it.
Okay. So the current CEO of TSMC is C.C. Wei, right? Charles Wei, right? And the prior CEO was Mark Liu, right? And Mark was originally seen as kind of the successor to Morris Chang, who's still around, by the way. He's still alive. And much of the reason why Mark was essentially strong-armed by the United States into agreeing to build the Arizona fab. And he agreed to do so, apparently without soliciting Morris's input.
Oh.
And Morris was not too happy, but he relented, and he just didn't raise it. But then that Arizona fab ran into a lot of execution issues, and Morris used that as an excuse to get rid of Mark. And then bring in C.C. Wei. So C.C. Wei is now the new CEO of TSMC. The culture at TSMC is still very Taiwan-centered and very resistant to actually exporting their manufacturing prowess abroad, right? And the U.S. is trying its very best to push more semiconductor manufacturing stateside, but it's kind of been the track record is pretty spotty, I would say, if that makes sense.
And the Taiwan administration isn't doing much to protect its chip industry, or it can't do anything about it?
No, of course not. First off, the DPP doesn't give two shits about Taiwan's chip industry. Like, I will just say that. The only political friend that Taiwan's chips industry has in its domestic politics is the KMT. Ironically enough, like the prior DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, she was the one who, as a trade negotiator, negotiated some of the trade agreements back in the late 80s and early 90s on behalf of Taiwan that created Taiwan's chip industry.
Right.
She understands the issue intimately. She is not ignorant. And yet she just stood as an idle bystander as the US abused TSMC. So I mean, you can say like someone like Lai Jingde he's a lawyer. He's a prosecutor by trade. He's not expected to understand this. But someone like Tsai Ing-wen, she's expected to understand it because she negotiated the damn agreement. And
actually, I would say Lai Jingde is even worse than a lawyer for politics. Lawyers know how to negotiate. He was a doctor.
Oh, okay. So he was an ideologue, a polemic.
Yeah, exactly.
So someone like Tsai, she's expected to understand this. She stood by. She let it happen on her watch. And now TSMC is forced into a deeply uncomfortable position. Now, the saving grace out of all this is that I think the last time you and I spoke, right, I had said that, hey, it's a possibility that Intel and Samsung might catch up to TSMC. Mm-hmm. Well, instead of catching up, I think they've fallen even further behind. They are struggling pretty badly.
And why is that?
Samsung is struggling because of execution problems and because Samsung Electronics is about to have its first labor strike, like labor union strike ever. So it's about to have like labor unrest, and Intel is running out of money. Like one of the things about Intel as a company, so every quarter, Intel needs about $6 billion of cash infusion to go and buy new chip making equipment to do its 5 nodes in 4 years strategy. And every quarter, Intel's operating cash flow is somewhere between 0 and negative 200 million.
Can you explain the 5 nodes strategy real quick for the audience? Just a simple explanation.
For sure. So chip making performance or chip making advancements are measured in what's called nodes, N-O-D-E, right? Nodes. And each node refers to a greater level of density of transistors on the chip. They're typically called nanometer, right? Referred to by a nanometer number. So like 10 nanometer, 7 nanometer node, 5, 3, 2, etc. And Intel's stated game plan when Pat Gelsinger, the current CEO, took over in 2021 was that in the next 4 years, from 21 to 25, Intel would advance 5 nodes. It would go from 10 down to 7, down to 5, down to 3, down to 2 by 2025. And that is a very aggressive schedule because typically you advance 1 node every 2 years. So when you do that kind of very aggressive advance, what ends up happening is you over-purchase equipment and you don't really let your manufacturing engineers stabilize the manufacturing process on any given node before immediately pushing them to go for a die shrink and go for the next node, right?
And there's no guarantee that it'll work, right?
Yes. So you're rolling the dice not just once, but 5 times in a row. That was Pat's crazy gamble, right? Now, credit to Pat, not many American CEOs could have credibly convinced their board to approve that kind of plan. And credit to Pat, he did. Credit to Pat, he's put the money where his mouth is. He's invested that way. Unfortunately, the gamble has not paid off for Intel. And I would say they are in deep trouble as a company. Samsung, I don't know what's wrong with them. All I know is that their 3 nanometer yields are hovering between 0 and 20% right now. And they seem incapable of actually raising it. In addition, Samsung is missing many of the pieces of IP. So they're missing many of those pictures of Jet Li that actually that people want on their movie posters. So they're an incomplete type of print shop. Only TSMC has all the IP, has the manufacturing capacity and reliability at this time in order to make large volumes of AI data center chips that everyone wants. So like that's kind of the situation.
And how's the mainland's push to develop its own chip manufacturing coming along ever since the sanctions?
The mainland's push has been quite successful. In fact, it's been exceeding expectations. Unfortunately, the mainland still has a considerably large amount of ground to go, right? The mainland's chip industry is dominated by one company, SMIC. It has a couple other smaller companies, but SMIC is really the company to watch, right? And the name stands for Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. So SMIC is the company to watch, and it was founded by TSMC alumni. So it's very close. Now, SMIC in 2021 was barred from buying certain types of U.S. equipment. In 2022, those restrictions tightened to where U.S. players can no longer service equipment that was installed at SMIC. In spite of that, in 2021, they were at 14 nanometers, and now SMIC is at 5. So SMIC has gone from 14 down to 10, down to 7, down to 5. So they have advanced 4 nodes since 2021 in 4 nodes in 3 years.
Last time we talked, you were talking about how they were having trouble getting past 7.
Mm-hmm. Now they have 7 and they're having trouble getting past 5.
So it's only a matter of time before they figure out 5 and perhaps start going to the next node.
Yeah, although getting past 5 requires a custom, like a next generation of lithography equipment, which they currently don't have, extreme ultraviolet lithography. And I know one of your readers sort of asked a question around whether China could get that kind of lithography equipment, because there's a different company that manufactures that, and they, like TSMC, are a monopolist as well. The company's name is ASML. It's a company in the Netherlands. And I think the answer for whether one of the Chinese government labs, which these are all government labs like really pursuing it, can actually make that work is really up in the air. I would surmise it's one of China's most closely guarded state secrets. And individuals who I talk to in China's semiconductor space are very, very reluctant to share any details about its progress. But the public facts that I can surmise, based off of patent filings and based off, reading various articles that have filtered out, like first, there is a prototype EUV machine that has been tested sometime in the past 12 months. Second, there are patents that have been filed for EUV photoresists, which are the specialty chemicals that you need to go and pattern until you slather these photoresists all over the wafer, essentially, and you shine the light on the photoresist to achieve a certain kind of chemical reaction. Each photoresist is tuned to a particular wavelength of light. So the fact that they have these photoresists suggests to me that they've been testing whatever prototype they have on that chemical mix in order to achieve the desired outcome, right? And third, they're now there have also been supplemental patents around 2 areas. First, in sort of handling the lenses, the sort of optics and lenses needed to reflect UV light. And second, the other thing they have is essentially a wafer handling system for vacuum environments, because EUV light ionizes the air, which means that the interior of an EUV machine actually has to be a near perfect vacuum. So like those 4 things added together tell me that there is active research here. As to whether they've completed the systems integration and finished the prototype that they're testing, I don't know. And I feel like anyone who says in public that they know is not credible, if that makes sense.
So before we proceed, just to give more information to the audience, could you please explain to them how every generation, the research and development for every new generation of chips is essentially like a roll with dice with God? And the second part is, how does the CHIPS Act force tech transfer on companies that have received subsidies from the U.S.?
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing is that advancing from one node to another is not a guarantee. There's no guarantee of success, right? You may fail, as Samsung has failed, right? Samsung tried advancing from 4 nanometer FinFET down to 3 nanometer gate all around, and it's having severe trouble, right? Intel is promising backside power delivery for its 20 angstrom and 18 angstrom, which are its 2 nanometer and 1.8 nanometer designs. And I've heard that BSPDN is having issues, right? So like every time you go down one of these ladders, it's like rolling dice with God. Really, you are rolling dice with God, because you will encounter so many different novel physics issues that are unforeseen, that it is essentially, it's quite somewhat random, right? Intel messed up the transition as a company from 14, I think they're stuck at 10 for a while. So they messed up the transition past 10 nanometers. And this cost Intel the lead versus TSMC back in 2016. This is one of the reasons why TSMC has been so successful. TSMC was more conservative. They opted for a more staggered approach past 10 nanometers. Intel was opting for a different path. In addition, they didn't want to use as many EUV machines in their path, because EUV machines at the time were very expensive, and TSMC sort of zoomed ahead, right? So that's one. So it's never a guarantee that any of these things work out. Now, because of how messed up Samsung is, and because of how Intel needs $6 billion every quarter just to fund its own CapEx plan, I think TSMC has a greater margin of error, greater room to breathe now than they did a year ago. Not really because TSMC has been doing anything particularly special, but because its competitors have fallen so hard, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of how the US CHIPS Act tries to stack the deck against TSMC, it's no surprise. I mean, the US government orders TSMC to share its order volumes with the US government. And those order volumes and customer orders are immediately shared then with Intel. So Intel it's as if like you're playing poker against someone, and you are forced to reveal your cards to your opponent the whole time.
And you say Intel is in a bad spot right now. Would this act kind of give them the edge that they need to recover?
The US hopes so. You know, the Chinese phrase 人算不如天算嘛, right? Like if God doesn't like you, there's only so much you can do. If your manufacturing process is messed up, it sort of doesn't matter if you know what your competitors, order volumes are. It's like the other guy has pocket aces. The other guy has aces and kings, and your guy keeps getting dealt like 2-3 or 2-4 again and again and again. It sort of doesn't matter. The guy could just the TSMC could just keeps getting dealt aces. You could just leave the aces there. Go have a drink of whiskey or something and then just come back.
Every now and then we have U.S. political figures who are a bit too honest and say the silent part out loud. And last year, the Republican presidential candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, said if he's elected, he'd defend Taiwan from the Chinese mainland until the U.S. can become self-sufficient in semiconductor manufacturing. And we know here at this podcast that keeping Taiwan firmly within the U.S. sphere of influence is part of a broader strategy of keeping the Chinese mainland encircled with the First Island chain. But it seems like some factions of the U.S. government recognize the unfeasibility of maintaining this arrangement forever. So would you say what Ramaswamy said from a U.S. perspective is a plan for a worst-case scenario?
I would believe so. Although, I would imagine that kind of the there's a general sense of desperation. It's not even just desperation. It's mask off. Right? Like the US, it's not that there's from time to time that they'll say these things. The frequency at which they say these kinds of things is going up. The mask is slipping across the collective Western establishment, right? As a result, you're kind of seeing just a more and more honest statements like this, right? So as for whether that's a worst case, I don't think that's a worst case. I think that's the base case. The base case is, yes, the U.S. will stand by Taiwan so long as Taiwan owns the future of the American AI industry. But past that point, I don't think the U.S. really cares that much.
It's not too concerned about...
Past that point, the U.S. doesn't care about Taiwan's survival. The U.S. would still care about using Taiwan as a cannon fodder.
Right.
In the Great Pacific War that is soon to come.
So how's the TSMC and the DPP navigating the pressures from the U.S. to comply with its geopolitical strategies, and what are the potential risks and rewards of this compliance?
I don't think the DPP has the best interests of the people of Taiwan at heart.
Definitely not.
I don't think so. I think neither does TSMC, but TSMC's interests are those of its shareholders. And ironically, right now, those interests are more aligned with the interests of the people of Taiwan than the interests of the DPP.
Well, exactly, because our economy is what TSMC and service industry. And you get rid of TSMC, economic growth is negative. So
yeah, and in addition to that, TSMC realizes that its continued survival as a corporate entity is inextricably linked to Taiwan.
So like you said, on the DPP just not giving two shits about the people on Taiwan, if it did and if it actually cared about the economy, then of course it would do everything it could to prevent TSMC from opening up fabs in Arizona. But as we've seen, there's little to no resistance coming from the administration here. Correct. Whereas when Taiwan was being economically built up, there was all sorts of protectionist policies that enabled us to get to where we are today, and all of that's gone now.
Yes, led by the KMT. And it's very interesting in my head that in spite of the DPP running Taiwan or having the presidency, they seem pretty bad at stealing TSMC. It's like they practically they control many levers of government, and even so, they're pretty bad. They're pretty ineffective at helping the U.S. steal TSMC. It's almost like you have two students in class, and one student scores 95, and this other student scores 65, and all the teachers want the student who scored 65 to beat the student who scored 95. But the student who scored 65 is just mentally deficient. And no matter how much help the teachers give that kid, he actually can't improve his score that well.
It's like leading a horse to water, but can't make it drink.
Yes.
Now, a related question from a listener is, TSMC recently opened a second plant in Japan, and its close proximity to the Chinese mainland makes no sense to her in terms of trading. Now, is this new plant to supply chips to the West since it's likely that the Arizona plant delivery will be delayed, or is it to offset tariffs and sanctions in the future in light of a possible reunification of China? And she says it's hard to understand why TSMC would risk opening new plants in both the US and Japan and risk technology transfer when mainland China is their biggest customer. And I think the mainland China being their biggest customer is incorrect, but you can elaborate on all of this.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of things. First, Japan has much more chip engineers than the US does. Because remember, it's a legacy of Japan's, Japan used to lead the world in making chips, right? So they still have quite a number of engineers. Second is that a lot of TSMC's own suppliers are in Japan. So remember how I was talking about photoresists earlier? Those ultra high purity chemicals, a lot of them actually come from Fujifilm and other companies in Japan. So locating the factory there is also simpler from an operations perspective. The third is that the Japanese government obviously gave TSMC a lot of money. The fourth is that you can think of this as TSMC trying to spread its bets. It doesn't want to just be in the US. It also wants to be more internationalized around the place.
I think spreading its bets is also why Taiwan is announcing multiple initiatives to build R&D centers in the Czech Republic. And the Czech government recently announced that the U.S. company, Onsemi, ONSEMI, will invest up to $2 billion towards its semiconductor production operations in the country. So
that's mostly automotive related. So
okay, because that's kind of close to Dresden, right? It's Dresden operations, if I'm correct.
Magdeburg, Dresden. So Magdeburg is in eastern.
So it's the automotive stuff. And what's the grand strategy behind this, or is it just? Do you have any insights?
That one the Europeans have been very bad at actually doing anything strategic in semiconductors besides giving Intel $10 billion to build something that's a white elephant. I don't think there is really a grand strategy. This is just more normal commercial stuff. And because of like how bad the European economy has done over the last decade, like the Czech Republic is actually pretty cheap. It's actually a pretty cheap outsourcing location. Even if you're a Taiwan company, like Czech wages are competitive, like compared to wages in Taiwan.
Another listener is curious about what you think the strategy of Chinese telecom and consumer electronics companies is going forward. Are they going to focus more on the domestic market and non-US foreign countries, or what?
Yeah, for sure. So, by the way, China Telecom is more the internet provider. Like I would say, Huawei is probably the leading consumer technology company in China.
Oh, he's not talking China Telecom. He's just saying telecom companies in general, as well as consumer electronics companies.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah. So, I think the Chinese tech sector is definitely going to go becoming increasingly domestic in China. It's going to retreat from the US and the EU, but it's also going to extend further and further into the global south. So it's going to increase exports to countries in Latin America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia.
And this listener has a much more technical question, and the terminology used might need to be explained by you. So he says there's EUV and DUV, and EUV is extreme ultraviolet lithography, a tech used to make military-grade chips that's only held by a Dutch firm, which obviously closely protects the tech and security and serves the tech and security interests of the West. Now he's curious about what you think of China's ability to develop comparable lithography processes, because China is still using DUV, which is older than EUV and a bit different. But, however, Chinese scientists have been able to innovate the DUV process to do things that US tech folks thought was impossible. And an example of this was the advanced chips found in the Mate 60. So in simple terms, can China develop something close to EUV in the years ahead? And what do you think it'll take, and will the US allow it to happen? And maybe you can also elaborate on how China is being creative with its use of DUV and pushing its boundaries.
Sure. So I'll do four things. First, I'll explain the difference between DUV and EUV. Second, I'll clarify some of the misconceptions around the military nature of EUV. Third, I'll try to explain sort of the how China has been able to crack kind of 7 and 5 nanometer nodes with only DUV, without EUV. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about kind of the EUV machine in China. So first, DUV is deep ultraviolet light, and it's typically at 193 nanometers of wavelength. EUV is extreme ultraviolet light. It is at 13.5 nanometers of wavelength. So think back to your high school physics class, the shorter the wavelength, the more energetic the light. The shorter the wavelength, the more the light will ionize the air. The shorter the wavelength, the harder it is for the light to be generated, because the more energetic the atom has to get before it throws off that kind of light, right? The higher the energy state of the source atom. So DUV does not necessarily need as many special ways to generate it. EUV can only be generated in one way, which is tin plasma, so a little ball of tin being turned into a plasma, either via electricity, so applying electricity to the tin, or by shooting it with a laser. Most people prefer the laser because the laser is more precise and tidy. This is kind of the difference between DUV and EUV. The second thing is, because EUV is so energetic, the machine has to be a vacuum. I think I mentioned this before, right? So you actually can't have air inside the machine. This creates huge amounts of issues. The third one is because the light is so energetic, you actually can't refract the light. So you have to reflect the light. What that means is normally, like if you shoot light at a little ball of tin, if you shoot a laser at a little ball of tin and light comes out, the light goes everywhere. It blooms out in a big sphere, right? But you need to capture all that light and somehow orient it in a single direction. Well, that means you need like something to either refract the light, like in a telescope, all the lenses in a telescope, or you need curved mirrors to go and bounce the light around, right? Because of how high energy the EUV light is, you need to use curved mirrors. If the EUV light tries going through a lens, it will actually burn the lens. So that's why It's all these mirrors, big curved funhouse mirrors in a vacuum, capturing light from a little explosion of tin, and then shining that light, focusing that light down onto a single silicon wafer. Right? So that's the difference between EUV and DUV. The second thing is that they said it's a military technology. It's actually not a military technology. It is 100% civilian technology. Most military chips are made on older nodes. Military chips are actually less advanced than civilian chips.
Because they value tested, tried and true, and stability over cutting edge, right?
Yes. So the F-35 CIP-2 is a PowerPC G431 chip. The PowerPC G431 chip is a designated family formerly used by Apple to describe a fourth generation of 32-bit PowerPC microprocessors. And the PowerPC, the G4, was first released in 2000, in the year 2000. And the generation of chip that is used in the F-35 is, I believe, the 90 nanometer MPC 7448, which is manufactured by Freescale Semiconductor on a 90 nanometer node. 90 nanometers, not 10, not 14, 90. It's a very old chip. And in fact, the design was introduced in 2005. So most advanced chip making nodes are nearly 100% dedicated to civilian use.
Now, can you talk a bit about how Chinese scientists have been pushing the limits of DUV, and also if China can develop something close to EUV in the years ahead?
So you use what's called multi-patterning to get around the DUV limitations. And that's where you basically, you shine the light in one place, you shift the wafer or shift the angle of the light a little bit, and then shine the light again, and then shift the angle a little bit, and then shine the light again, right? So instead of shining a single beam at 13.5 nanometers, you shine the same beam at 193, but you shine it like 8 or 9 times in a row. And that's how you get around the limitations of not having EUV. It's obviously less efficient. It's obviously more prone to error. It's also much more costly as a result. But you are able to get around it. Now, it is likely not economical to use that method to get around 5, to get past 5, because past 5, the yield, it is so burdensome and so like the yields are so low that it is just, it's just too costly. Now, lastly, for EUV, I think I talked a little bit about this, but I think China probably has a prototype machine, and I think that as to whether that when that enters production, I think they are very tight-lipped about it.
And of course, the U.S. would do all it can to sabotage it, right?
Well, I mean, I think it would not be too happy about it, and I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. was trying to sabotage it. That wouldn't surprise me in the least.
Now, what are some of the emerging trends in the chip industry that you haven't gone over yet that you believe will significantly impact global geopolitics?
So I think first off, the war in Gaza, the Israeli sort of I don't know what is the right term to use, but the Israeli military actions in Gaza have really created a very large wedge between the United States and the global South. And that wedge is unlikely to be healed anytime in the foreseeable future. I'll give you an example. The State Department actually does regular public opinion polling in multiple countries, right? This is just part of its normal diplomatic intelligence, right? And I think public opinion polls between September of last year and now across the 11 or 12 core states of the Middle Eastern North or Africa region have shown levels of approval of the United States falling from somewhere between 30 to 50% or 30 to 40% down to between 0 and 10%. I think in 7 out of the 11 or 12 countries, the level of support for the United States is actually below the poll's margin of error, which basically means it's effectively 0%. The US has a 0% approval rating in those countries, which means that any public diplomacy between the governments of those countries and the United States is dead. It's impossible. Now, of course, many of those countries are run by autocrats, so it's they don't need public approval to continue dealing with the U.S. But even so, autocrats don't really want to waste political capital either, right? And they don't really want to do things that are too unpopular just for free, right? So that's one thing. Now, more broadly speaking, across other countries in the global south, it's also created a massive wedge, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, right?
Huge Muslim populations.
Yeah. You know a guy named Ian Miles Chong?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think about him?
He's I don't think he's very smart.
Okay. So anyhow, the thing is, the reason I just bring him up, I don't really pay attention to him all that much, but like the reason I bring him up is I saw a piece of news where the Malaysian government, there was a local NGO in Malaysia that apparently filed suit to have him extradited back to Malaysia for issuing statements in support of Israel. So this is in Indonesia and Malaysia, opinions of the U.S. and Israel are rock bottom, right? If that's the case, right?
I see that even in Taiwan, because there's a lot of migrant workers from Indonesia. And one time I was invited to join this protest against the American Institute in Taiwan, the de facto embassy here, against its support for the actions in Gaza. And I think in the crowd there were more Indonesians than local Taiwanese.
That's very interesting. What do the local Taiwanese think about this issue?
I think most people just don't really think of it either way. They just kind of see it in the news and they're like, oh, well, one side is being very bad and the other side they're being told are terrorists. And then there's also some shitlibs who rightfully side with and sympathize with the Gazans, but then they try to tie their struggles with, their little pet projects of supporting Ukraine or like Taiwan separatism. The public opinions are all over the place. Most people are just kind of casually observing, I would say.
Okay. And here's my big thing. I think a lot of that is because they aren't actually seeing that, because a lot of videos that Israelis are making are actually being censored. Not because of the videos that Palestinians are making are being censored, but Israelis. Right now, what I've been told by people who work at social media companies is that the Israeli videos are far more violent and disturbing than the Palestinian ones. And not necessarily in the sense of portraying Israel as a victim, but no. These are videos where many Israeli youth proudly endorse genocide.
They're proud of it. Yeah.
They're proud of killing as many Palestinians as they can. And many of these videos debate whether it is better to expel all the Palestinians out of Israel or kill them all. Literally unabashedly, just straight up, just genocide, right? And a lot of these videos are censored by these social media platforms.
Well, yeah, it's bad for ads.
Well, yeah, but if audiences actually saw those videos, I think global public opinion would swing against Israel even more harshly than it already has.
Right. Now, on a related note, since we're talking about politics right now, is I know I think last year or 2 years ago, you were very pessimistic about enlightening the victory and what it meant for the well-being of the people on Taiwan. Now, as of the recording today, he just completed his first month in office. So has reality met your expectations, or what's the deal, in your opinion?
So I'm happy that Lai Ching-te appears to be very ineffective. And I'm happy that, the legislative yuan in Taiwan is still controlled by the opposition. I think those two essentially would, they provide, yeah, well, they don't neutralize him, but they at least introduce more optimism into my calculus than a few years ago.
I think a few years ago you were betting on like the DPP winning just having control of the parliament again, like in the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but what we see is for the leadership, a lot of people didn't vote. So if you count the people who abstained, Lai Ching-te won with only a third of the constituency voting for him, if less than a third, actually. So he has no popular support. He just got a little bit more support than the other two candidates.
I see.
And as far as the parliament, well, it's in controlled by the opposition. So whatever Lai wants to do, if he wants to declare independence or separatism, good luck with that. He has no avenue.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the US itself is not all that interested in instability in Taiwan right now. I think it was more interested 2 years ago, but now it's because of how badly Intel and Samsung are doing. It's not like there's no alternative right now. Now, if all of a sudden Intel catches up in chips, if Intel catches up in chips, that's when you know the U.S. no longer fears, kind of like fear. Like that's when the U.S. may like sort of intervene more forcefully to push the two sides of the strait towards war.
Yeah, people need to understand this. It's not that the U.S. actively wants war with on two sides of the strait at all times. It takes its own geopolitical considerations as priority. That's why when the U.S. sent the 7th Fleet into Taiwan Strait, it wasn't just to prevent the communists from coming here. It was to prevent Chiang Kai-shek from launching a counterattack as well.
Yeah.
So I think we've gone over a lot from technology to geopolitics. So do you have any closing remarks for the audience?
For sure. I would just like to say that first, thank you so much for having me on the show.
No, thanks for coming on.
Yeah. And second, I think it's vital that people, in Taiwan understand that a lot of the media that they consume, not media like yours, but a lot of the media they consume is not even just biased. It literally is irrelevant to the things that will actually affect their lives. Because this thing around the chip industry, the geopolitical tensions, these are the things that are actually going to affect their lives. And it is vital that they go and focus on it instead of being distracted by what kind of these pan-green influencers want them to focus on. Things like cultural issues or things like that. Those things are mostly irrelevant.
Right. I did my 1-year substitute service in Zhusan, Nantou, right? Over there, it's a very rural area, and people are very more culturally, they're more conservative. And on a gut instinct level, they know that the stuff that the media says is all a distraction. They don't necessarily know what's true or what's not true. They just know that they get lied to all the time, and they have this sort of distrust in the media, and they don't have that unreasonable fear of the mainland. I hear people there talking all the time, oh, yeah, so-and-so's kids going to study or work on the mainland. Things over there are looking quite positive. They're improving really quickly. Their quality of life is better than a lot of parts of Taiwan. You hear those voices there, but of course these are the voices that are not going to be amplified, especially not to a Western audience, because you have I think with the exception of just more alternative media like myself, most of the English language stuff, most of Taiwan's coverage in the English language is what the administration here, as well as the U.S. ruling elites, want the people in the West to think. Would you agree with this assessment?
100%. And voices on like if the voices speaking in Mandarin to people in Taiwan were bad, like the voices that speak on behalf of Taiwan in English are like by and large kind of fairly useless, right? I listen to people like Lev Nachman or like Brian Hyoe, and I just it's like a sense of sadness. It's just like these people are not only wasting their own lives in trying to cover things that don't matter.
Well, that's why they're all depressed.
They're wasting the time and lives of other people, their audience.
Yeah, in a sense, I kind of feel bad for those people because they don't seem too happy about what they're doing.
It's they make $4,000 a month or $3,000 a month, and they get to pretend like they're important. That's pretty much their life.
Well, once again, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wealth of knowledge. And hey, if any new developments happen and you really want to share things with my audience that you think are relevant, that
if there's anything else that comes up, I'll send it along.
Just let me know. You're welcome back at any time.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the next episode.
Yeah, pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Strait Talk. For more perspectives on Taiwan, cross-strait relations, mainland China, and beyond not covered by mainstream media, please be sure to subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as on YouTube or Rumble. If you have any feedback or suggestions, write an email to me at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. I'd now like to shout out my upper-level patrons and YouTube channel members, Alvin Jia, Wang Yijing, Pernell Sima, Michael Kim, Coconut, Victor Wei, and Alaskan Land Bridge Project. Strait Talk with Xiangyu is a passion project of mine, with the aim of shining a light on the history, current events, and geopolitics of this region from the ground with no bullshit. And if you wish to support my endeavors, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, becoming a channel member on YouTube, or by making a one-time donation to any of the links in the show notes. If this show continues to grow, I hope to give you guys better production value with better video equipment and perhaps a more professional space. And also fund more trips in this region so I can go on fact-finding journeys and incorporate them into the show. With all that being said, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.
还是人情浓。